So good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Gary Blohm. I have, as was mentioned, many different hats. I'm the director of the Army Geospatial Center, and also at my location, I have the Geospatial Research Laboratory. So we do science and technology, we do data, we do systems integration, and then, as mentioned, I'm the Geospatial Information Officer for the Army. And in my history, I was in the CIO for many years, and so I have that perspective as well. I want to thank General Easley for some of the comments he made this morning and setting the stage a little bit for multi-domain applications, multi-domain operations, and how we fit into that. And I'm going to focus on that. So I have about a half hour. I'm going to try to get through my talk really fast and give you about 15 minutes for questions. It's all about data. And let's see. If I go to the next chart. It's all about data, and it's all about being enterprise. And I like to tell the story that Army Geospatial Center is all about the Army priorities. And the top two priorities, one is readiness, and geospatial intelligence data is a fundamental piece of Army readiness every single day. And so our partnerships, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on, with NGA and others and you, help enable that readiness so we could, if necessary, fight tonight. But I'll focus a little bit more on modernization, the number two priority of the Army. And so I have a mixed list there of modernization priorities and the CFTs. There's long-range precision fires, and General Easley was asked the question, where's the top priority for AI? Well, long-range precision fires is the Secretary's and the Chief's number one modernization priority. Next generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, the network, C3I, although mostly talked about with the network. Underneath that is also assured PNT. So if there's two CFTs for the network priority, air and missile defense, soldier lethality, underneath soldier lethality, a synthetic training environment. So where the heck is geospatial geointelligence? It's not called out anywhere specifically in those priorities, but it is embedded in every single one. And Army Futures Command understands that we can be fully successful on delivering all these things, but if we don't integrate those capabilities, if we don't do things in the cyber realm, in the electromagnetic spectrum world, and geospatial, geointelligence data, and bringing these things together, the Army modernization approach will not be successful. And so I encourage you, if you haven't seen General Easley's a presentation this morning, to go look up on the Army websites and look for the multi-domain operations video. It's very helpful in understanding at a high level the concept for the Army. If we can go to the next slide. I got to get better graphics. That's MDO, not the video you saw this morning. But really, geospatial is an organizing principle for that. And so that's what I've been spending a lot of my time with Army Futures Command, with the CFTs, General Wesley and the Future Capabilities Center down at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and helping them understand where do we need to go, what data do we need in the future. If we're going to be doing this in a near-peer environment, what data do I need ahead of time, especially when we get into a potential electromagnetic fight where the communications tactically are not always available. So if I go to the next slide. Well, why is it important? Well, first of all, this crowd doesn't need this, but I spend a lot of time educating folks in, is the world mapped? Is it, I have this data already. Why do I need all this geospatial data? And it's really talking about the data that's underlying on those different layers of those maps and providing that as a common feature across all the systems we have, and I'll talk about that in a second. If I go to the next slide. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to enable a content-managed, single shareable geospatial foundation, have the same maps, imagery, elevation data, terrain features available across multiple different echelons that's tied to the NSG architecture and shareable with our unified partners. And I think Admiral Sharp talked a little bit about this yesterday as well. Having that data shareable is key. Otherwise, we can't fight off the same common operating picture. And so really, it's about that single shareable foundation. And so if you go to the next slide, that's a lot of stuff. So I think at one of the panels yesterday, they talked about the scale. To scale is a big deal for the Army. We have a lot of systems, Mission Command, Intelligence, the DSIGS program. We have systems at different echelons with different capabilities, from the handheld, tablet in a vehicle, the command post, fire systems, all kinds of data, all kinds of systems that need that single shareable map, all connected through a network that doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure that we have in the commercial environment. And so besides the scale of this, I ask you to think about when you talk to us about your capabilities, how am I going to pass that data in a tactical environment? How am I going to pass it to a command post? How am I going to pass it to a command post if maybe all my SATCOM capabilities aren't there in an electronic warfare environment? How am I going to pass that data to the handheld, where the bandwidth is really short and I don't have that PCS infrastructure? So as we look at this, we need you to help us figure out how are we going to architect that? Where do I need to cache data? Where do I need, how am I going to distribute this? And then how do I get data back from the theater to update as things are happening in a real-time environment? So I keep that common level of understanding across all echelons. I would argue that some of those architectural pieces are really the challenge that I face. If I can go to the next slide. I was really pleased, although not surprised, knowing Admiral Sharp, that he talked a lot about partnerships. And we really rely on NGA for much of what we do. And so when NGA develops and dictates the standards, it's my job as the GIO of the Army to make sure that we're complying with that across all these systems. I go out and I certify, make sure we're doing our job. I, with the Army G2, help provide NGA what our requirements are. And then NGA, with their funding limited resources, will come back and say, hey, this is what I can do, this is what I can't. And so the Army does try to augment what the products and capabilities we can get from NGA as necessary. And so we have a tight partnership with NGA. It's key to Army operations. And as a matter of fact, I'll be going with my boss, General Semonite, to visit Admiral Sharp later this week. If I go to the next slide. A lot of pictures, a lot of words you probably can't read, but in the middle, what that really represents is a common operating environment with different computing environments. There's real time, and there's a couple unique ones with sensors, but think of it mostly as the smartphone, the tablet, and the computer, and then the cloud. And how do we tie our systems into that environment? And I'll tell you, the geospatial community was the first to really embrace this concept that came out of the Army CIG-6 and ASAULT as a way to have that single shareable map across all Army systems. And what I show around there, and I'll go through the different organizations, you can see there's an S&T element in the lower left, that's the GRL piece, warfighter support, and then the system acquisition support on the lower right. If I can go to the next slide. I'm only going to talk about a couple of these columns here, but the one on the left is real critical and real important for the Army. And by the way, Mike Harper, I know Mike's here someplace, he's in the back, runs this directive for me. So what do? We provide engineering support both for operating and generating force. We do support directly for COCOMs. We provide analyst support. We collect data. It's really a critical function to help fill in those gaps, those tactical gaps that we have. And there are many of them. And there's probably not enough money for me to get all the capabilities and all the resources I want. Very important mission. I'll give an example of some of the uses of, and one of the capabilities that Mike brings to the table, historical photo analysis, an example of how using geospatial technologies, we can take and look at historical photos of areas of EPA interest, if you will. What are the Superfund sites? How do we clean them up? And we found that with our analysts looking at this, we've actually reduced the cost of many cleanups, where the initial plan might be to cover an area so large, and based on the analysis that we do, we can shrink that capability up and really reduce the footprint of things we're looking at. What's not on the chart, other things that he does is finding soldiers missing in action, looking at historical photos. We've done this many different theaters, and really a very important mission, especially to those families that have lost loved ones in wars gone by. If we go to the next chart, I'll talk about the fourth column with just a prettier picture up there. We're all going to this high resolution color, imagery, and elevation data that can be shared. And for me, it's critical for us to have that sharing element across all those echelons, thank you, and again with our partners. And this is where some of the technology challenges come into place. And I'll talk a little bit about, you heard yesterday about the game or the entertainment industry. And we're going to be doing more work with the modeling and sim and training piece of the Army. And how do we bring that kind of flashy imagery that they want, and how do we bring that together with the data we're working? And so Mike and his team will be a critical part of that. If we go to the next slide, if you haven't heard the term Mission Command Intelligence, it's something that General Barrier, Army G2, has been talking about. It's really his vision of the way forward on how do we bring intelligence systems for the next generation of Army users. And by the way, this team is led by Dan Vazone, sitting up here in front in red. And how do we work that next generation of geointelligence, geospatial intelligence in support of MCI and ground station support? It's very important for us to also look at, again, how do we get that data into the theater at the right echelon? State-of-the-art equipment, the NFIRE is a good example. Providing state-of-the-art, but it comes out of industry. The NFIRE program does nothing more than look for the best of breed from you all and provide those capabilities in a standard way for our soldiers in theater to collect local data. And then it's our job to help figure out how do we integrate that data as an enterprise asset. In the third column, it's really how do we provide that architecture? How do we provide those standards across all the Army acquisition programs? It takes a lot of partnership with our PEO customers, all across ASALT. And now we have many more partners we got to collaborate with the CFTs, and how do we accelerate all this modernization of priorities. One example is One World Terrain. If you haven't heard of One World Terrain, it's the foundation for the synthetic training environment that General Maria Gervais is working. It's something that was built for training and gaming systems. It's data that's pretty to look at. It'll provide a great gaming experience. And how do we take that and take that single shareable geospatial foundation and support both communities? How do we provide the right data that we need? It's a clash of cultures, to be frank. And so we have PEOs that are worried, what's that mean to my programs? What kind of information are you going to try to transport over what radio? How is that going to work? Yet I have a training environment and a need to not only train, but mission rehearse in specific areas. I think there's tremendous opportunity here. There's some challenges out there. I look for industry to help me figure out those challenges. How do I converge those communities? How do I converge those requirements? And how do I come up with solutions that will meet the needs for that next potential fight? Standards, why are they important? And when you meet a standard, is that good enough? If you go to the next slide, it's a little bit outdated. And I've taken the names off to protect the guilty at the bottom. But those are actual pictures of real Army systems, all, by the way, following the standard that NGA and us as a GIO said you had to follow. But implemented differently with different profiles, very different looks and feels. And if that's a common operating picture, well, I guess I'm in the wrong job because I don't believe that's a common operating picture. It's something that's, you'd say, well, you're going to solve it and it'll be over. But as technology changes, as standards keep on evolving and updating, this is always going to be our challenge. How do I provide that same picture to the handheld device, into the command post, back at higher headquarters, the mission command system, the intelligence system, the fire system, all seeing that same picture and having that same understanding. A little bit on some of the research we do. So if you really think about using geospatial as an organizing principle, next chart, please. I'm not going to talk about all the pictures on the slide, but we have a system called map-based mission planning. That's using the map as an organizing principle for planning. Automation. How do we automate the processes that we can automate into that environment? So there's some potential machine learning and AI challenges. How do we have shareable 3D information? How do we pass 3D information? If you look at one of the pictures, it's a building with that just is represented by some green lines. Well, geez, that doesn't seem very forward. I like the pretty picture, but if I want to get that over a tactical radio, how do I back out to get the right information to the right echelon? So we're looking at all kinds of capabilities to try technologies to try to shrink the data required that we can get them over the tactical network, just as a couple examples. And then in my final slide is I have the Army Geospatial Enterprise node in my building in Alexandria, Virginia. It's where I bring technology, data, and the systems together to work through and integrate, make sure the systems are talking to each other, and accelerate transition from the science and technology world into systems and programs of record. And so, don't have as much time for questions as I wanted, but let me do some questions. The relationship to NGA slide was terrific for us GeoINTers. I'm not going to read the second half of the question because I like the first half. Where do you see gaps and challenges? I think it's not really a gap, but the gap is we have more requirements than we have resources to do everything we want to do. And so it's really prioritization. So NGA requires the Army to really think about and prioritize what we need from them. And then how do they figure out that prioritization across domains? And that all comes down to communications, communications, communications. So I don't know that it's a gap. Relationships, you never fix a relationship and have it work all the time. You got to keep on working the relationship over time. So if we have a challenge, it's keeping it up. I think Admiral Sharp brings a focus on supporting the warfighter, and I think that's something we're looking forward to. Regarding shareable 3D data, how can industry help, and what is your ask of us? I think my first ask is make sure you understand what do we need. And there's different communities. So if you ask the synthetic training environment community, what do they need, you're probably going to get a different answer than if you talk to somebody who's working the intel side. Right? The gaming is looking for an experience, a 3D experience. The intel side and the mission command side is looking for actionable information that's verifiable, that if I'm going to do a fires, or if I'm going to do maneuver, I need certain levels of detail. Make sure you first of all understand both sides of a problem. And then when you explain your technologies to us and how you think you can solve that, help us understand what the architecture is. Can we do that with one set of data architecture? Do we need to have some alternatives in there to support both missions? I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think the Army's asked me to try to figure that out. So when we support PM Mission Command and we support DSIGs and Mission Command Intelligence, and we support the synthetic training environment, that we have a path forward that understands that and lays out those off-ramps. Who is leading the technical specs and contracting support one world terrain, base elevation, and 3D content? So I think we're working that answer. Right now, General Gervais has a team that is working that. She is leveraging a lot of the folks at PEO STRI and that community. But we're stepping up. We're saying we're the Army Geospatial Center. We think we should be leading this whole thing for the Army. But what does that mean? I think that's the question I want to ask. What does that mean, and how do I step up to help do that? Is there an open competition? So there is some competition efforts, some things, OTAs, that General Gervais has been doing. If I knew, I couldn't probably tell you because of the competition phase. I'm not up to speed. I have folks in the audience that know more about that. Have not seen an FBO release from any agency. If you're really interested in that question, come try to see me afterwards. I'll connect you to my guy. But I want to be very careful. I'm not going to get into what acquisitions that General Gervais has. Is that it for questions?